The Egyptian cult of Isis, one of the most popular and best documented non-indigenous religions of pre-Christian Europe. She was a goddess worshipped already in the Pyramid Age, but her greatest success came after the fall of the pharaonic state. It was then that on the ships of Egyptian merchants, Isis sailed from the ports of Alexandria to the wide waters of the Mediterranean Sea, conquering the Hellenistic world, penetrating religious and cultural environments wherever she appeared, adapting and evolving constantly. Never losing her Egyptian identity, she became a universal, cosmopolitan deity, the queen of every land. Wherever she arrived, she was worshipped as an all-powerful cosmic goddess, and at the same time as a kind lady concerned about the fate of man, as the one who promises prosperity and eternal life to all her followers. Around the 3rd century BC, she reached Italy. Then the Romans encountered her for the very first time. Today we'll follow the extraordinary story of the cult of Isis in ancient Rome. From its humble beginnings, the first persecutions through gradual integration, to the apogee of Isis' popularity, when she represented the divine authority of the emperors and reached the top of the Roman pantheon, when she was titled Una que es omnia dea Isis, being one, you are all goddess Isis. Her cult in the eternal city attracted masses, and processions of her followers were a common sight on the streets of Rome, and these were colorful spectacles, full of mysterious and exotic rituals. The white robes, shaved heads, and Anubis masks worn by her priests attracted Romans interested in alternative Egyptian spirituality, who, feeling abandoned by their own capricious gods, sought salvation in her. As we will see, among the crowds of her followers, one could meet both slaves and emperors. Although a foreign deity, Isis played a great role in shaping the ideals of Romanness. Hello everyone, my name's Irena. Welcome to my channel Ancient Science Girl. I invite you to a podcast about ancient history. Today I'll tell you about the most popular Egyptian goddess who conquered the hearts and minds of the ancient Romans. How did Egyptian culture affect them? What do we know today about the Roman worshippers of Isis, about the mysterious world of the Isiacs, about their temples and secret rituals? And how did the Senate and emperors influence the development of this cult? To answer these questions, as usual, we'll reach for the original ancient texts. The mythological struggle between Horus and Seth was the main founding myth of the Pharaonic Empire for 3,000 years. This ancient tradition was enriched at the end of the Old Kingdom by the Osirian myth, according to which the conflict of the gods was preceded by the fratricidal act of Seth. He annihilated the rightful just ruler Osiris and then usurped his throne. The epic journey of Isis, sister and wife of Osiris in search of the parts of his dismembered body, the revenge of her son Horus and his eventual accession to the father's throne, are stories that shaped Egyptian religiosity. As omnipresent in their rituals, they accompanied Egyptians in everyday life. The myth supported the age-old early dynastic concept of Horus, embodied by the person of the pharaoh, the living god. This idea of kingship, providing a reliable mechanism of political control, guaranteeing social stability, was preserved by the Macedonian Ptolemies, and after them, by the Roman emperors. The Greeks, however, had encountered Egyptian gods long before the Macedonian rulers appeared. Already at the beginning of the Egyptian late period, in the 7th century BC, the first ruler of the 26th dynasty, Psamtik I, established a garrison of Greek mercenaries at Daphne in the eastern Nile Delta. They quickly discovered common features between Greek and local Egyptian deities. They identified Isis with Demeter, Osiris with Dionysus, and Horus with Apollo. This divine family seemed to them the most revered, and not without reason. The troubled times of the late period saw the weakening of the pharaonic empire, devastating wars and foreign influences. In these unstable times, the position of the once powerful and great state religious centers, such as Theban Karnak, Memphis, or Heliopolis, has weakened significantly. So the Egyptians gather around the old proven religion of the savior Osiris, whose cult reaches its climax precisely in the late period. Isis, the divine wife of Osiris, also attains an increasingly higher position. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, already in the 5th century BC, Isis grows into a practically henotheistic chief deity, worshipped by all Egyptians as a sovereign sun goddess, demiurge, mistress of the elements, personification of motherhood, protector of birth and harvests, and even, although without theological evidence, savior of the dead. Isis takes over the roles and functions of the earlier heavenly mother goddesses like Hathor, Nut, and Neith, and becomes a universal deity. Her position grows constantly. The Greeks thus encountered for the first time this new Isis, who to a large extent represented the pantheistic worldview, natural for the Egyptians, but it must have caused astonishment among the Greeks. The Ptolemies, who ruled Egypt from the 4th century BC, established a new supreme cult of Serapis, the patron of the dynasty, associated with the then extremely popular cult of the sacred bull Apis, who embodied both Osiris and the Memphite creator god Ptah. Serapis, the syncretic deity, also had attributes of the Greek Zeus, Dionysus, and Asclepius. This was to satisfy the religious needs of the Greeks, who were arriving in increasing numbers in Egypt. Serapis also took over some of the attributes of Osiris, but didn't replace him from Egyptian myths and rituals. Although the new god of Alexandria was shown in the company of Isis, they were even called the Divine Family, Osiris remains the central figure of Isiac ceremonies. The cult of Serapis, directly connected with the capital of Egypt, quickly merged into the pantheons of the cities dependent on the power of Alexandria, the greatest economic power at that time, supplying grain to the entire Mediterranean coast. It's worth remembering that from the opening of the Alexandrian ports until late antiquity, Egypt was the largest exporter of grain, the granary of Europe, so it's all the more surprising that today this country is the largest importer of grain in the world. The official political cult of Serapis, around which the trade associations of the Greek cities gathered, was accompanied by Isis, identified with Demeter. Isis, a beautiful goddess with her mysteries and a universal seductive doctrine. She appeared at a time of disintegration of the world of polis, at a time of confrontation between the Greeks and new, unknown worlds. This confrontation culminated in the conquering wars of Alexander the Great, and now the Eastern Mediterranean world under Macedonian rule had to redefine itself. At that time, the cult of Isis was gaining more and more followers among the Greeks. Although it was Hellenized, it was still exotic. Like other Eastern cults, it offered a new, alternative form of religiosity. It seems that the pessimism of those times, disappointment with the lack of communication with traditional gods, and finally curiosity, made people of the Hellenistic period look for new ideas. Isis differs radically from the traditional Olympian gods. With her omnipotence, she's able to defeat all the forces that tyrannize people in their daily lives, especially the all-powerful Tyche, or Fortuna, as the Romans called her, the capricious dispenser of blind fate. Isis, the main character of the more and more popular among the Greeks Osirian myth, who herself once experienced enormous personal misfortunes, appears as a tireless defender of the righteous and at the same time an embodiment of all virtues. She's an all-powerful lady of a philanthropic nature, expressed in her providence, and her divine providence is the basic condition for order and harmony to prevail over chaos. Isis was considered to be the ruling over the universe, the cosmocrator, able to control time and space, but at the same time the one who promises to overcome all human difficulties, guarantees worldly prosperity and salvation after death. In short, she offers her followers an absolute sense of security. Of course, the main means of facilitating the propagation of all the doctrines, the good news that the Isiac circles preached, was the widespread use of the Greek language, the lingua franca of the era. Inscriptions in honor of Isis have been found throughout the Greek world. They were usually called arethologies, widely spread stories of the virtues and miraculous deeds of the deity. This is also a method of popularizing the cult and teaching the deeper meaning of religious doctrines. In the so-called the Sime arethology, found in the city of Sime in Aeolis, Asia Minor, we read, "I am Isis, the mistress of every land, and I was taught by Hermes, and with Hermes I devised letters, both the sacred hieroglyphs and the demotic, that all things might not be written with the same letters. I gave and ordained laws for men, which no one is able to change. I am eldest daughter of Cronos. I am wife and sister of King Osiris. I am she who finds fruit for men. I am mother of King Horus. I am she that rises in the dog star. I divided the earth from the heaven. I showed the paths of the stars. I ordered the course of the sun and the moon. I made with my brother Osiris an end to the eating of men. I revealed mysteries unto men. I taught men to honor images of the gods. I consecrated the precincts of the gods. I broke down the governments of tyrants. I made an end to murders. I compelled women to be loved by men. I made the right to be stronger than gold and silver. I ordained that the truth should be taught good. I devised marriage contracts. I assigned to Greeks and barbarians their languages." Interestingly, the author of this Hellenistic text from the 1st century BC, a certain Demetrius, assures that he copied it from a stele in the Egyptian city of Memphis. The second category of arithological texts are praises to the goddess directed by her followers, such as a text from the 2nd century BC found in the Thracian Maronea. We read, "Gaia, they say, is the mother of all. From her who was first you were born as her daughter. You took Serapis as your companion, and after you instituted legitimate marriage, the world shone out before your faces, illuminated by Helios and Selene. Thus you are too, and yet you are called the many by men. Life indeed knows you alone to be the gods." Such public professions of faith aroused sympathy for the foreign goddess and gave credibility to the cult, which in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC developed almost everywhere around the eastern coast of the Mediterranean. wherever Alexandrian merchants reached on their ships with Egyptian grain and all kinds of goods. The cult reached Attica as early as the 4th century BC with Egyptian merchants, and already in the 3rd century BC, the priest of the Isiac community in Athens was an Athenian citizen. The same thing happened on Delos, the sacred island of Apollo, with whom Horus, the son of Isis, was commonly identified. Delos, the trading center of the Aegean Sea, was economically closely linked to Alexandria. A large and important sanctuary of Serapis was built here, along with, of course, a temple of Isis. The beginnings were modest, as we are informed by an inscription found on the island. As early as the 4th century BC, an Egyptian priest arrived at Delos with a cult statue of his god, whom he worshipped privately in his home, as did his son and grandson. Serapis was to appear to the latter in a dream, ordering the construction of a temple on the island. The priest completed the temple in 6 months, but the authorities of Delos opposed the foreign cult, so Serapis himself was said to have intervened. According to accounts, the inhabitants of the island witnessed a miracle that intimidated his opponents. Serapis was creating his own unique triad on Delos with Isis and Anubis. Delos was maintaining economic relations with Sicily and with the cities of southern Italy, where, along with the Delian merchants, Isis also arrived. With the annexation of these lands by the Republic, the Romans, finally, encountered her cult for the very first time. An unconditionally expressed creed wasn't and couldn't be part of Roman religion. Unlike contemporary beliefs, those of Eastern origin, the main goal of traditional Roman religion wasn't to satisfy emotional needs, but to maintain beneficial mutual relations between gods and people. Only the observance of rituals, performing them, guaranteed pax deorum, peace of the gods, which was to result on the principle of reciprocity in pax hominum. Of course, these old patterns proved inadequate in times of many successive crises that weakened the structure of society. Foreign cults found their supporters at that time not because of any particular need for an alternative, higher spirituality among the Romans, but because socio-political conditions enabled them to find acceptable alternatives. New cults and deities could be incorporated into the existing system, but they had to be approved by a leading political institution, Senate or later emperor, before they could be introduced into Rome's pomerium, cross the special sacred line that marked the city's borders. According to legend, these borders were plowed by the founder of Rome himself, Romulus, in 753 BC. New cults approved by the authorities had to be integrated into the existing system, but remained under official supervision. Despite the traditional distrust of non-Roman cults, in 204 BC, the very popular religion of Cybele, originating from Asia Minor and worshipped by the Phrygians as a mother goddess, in Rome called Magna Mater, was officially recognized. The mystery cult of Cybele, like the esoteric cult of Mithra, was characterized by blood baptisms, an initiation sacrifice called taurobolium. The initiate descended into an underground room, over which a bull was sacrificed in such a way that the animal's blood flowed onto the worshipper, who moistened his tongue with blood, took a bath as a sacrament cleansing from sin, in order to be born again for eternity. Although not as bloody, The cult of Isis also attracted Roman followers with its atmosphere of mystery, secret initiation rituals, and attractive processions full of mysterious exotic symbols, such as priests wearing the mask of Anubis, which, as we know, in Pharaonic Egypt was only worn by priests supervising the mummification process. Undoubtedly, the Romans must have been more impressed by the complex ceremonial life of Isiacs, their special clothing and behavior, than by the sacred Isiac texts. Some found in the mysteries of Isis an escape from the grim reality. Others succumbed to the promises of salvation and the afterlife. Until recently, it was thought that most of her followers were non-Romans and the Roman lower class. Everything indicates, however, that this wasn't a cult of the rejected ones. From ancient sources, we know that the Isiacs included women, children, slaves and freedmen, veterans and soldiers, merchants, officials of all ranks, and even members of the imperial family. This mass movement embraced all social groups, attracted foreigners because it provided a form of social integration through the congregation, and the elites were fascinated by her aspects as a protectress against fate, as the one dispensing wealth and bringing victory. Isis was titled Augusta, Regina, and Domina. She was triumphalis and invicta, unconquered and triumphant. Interestingly, the traditional maternal aspect of Isis, in contrast to Egypt and Greece, seemed to be less important to the Romans. The Roman idea of the all-powerful, beautiful Isis is perfectly captured in what is now considered one of the oldest novels, Metamorphoses, better known under the title The Golden Ass, by the Numidian author and philosopher Lucius Apuleius. We know it thanks to the Benedictine monks who copied the work in the 11th century. Lucius describes in the form of an autobiography the epiphany of Isis, who appears to him in response to his imploring prayers. The author was in serious trouble. While trying to perform a magic spell to transform him into a bird, he accidentally turns into a donkey. Desperate, he goes to the seashore where Isis appears to him in full glory in a dream. We read, "When I had ended this prayer, finding my pleas to the goddess brought to light, I most fortunately fell asleep, whereupon a divine and venerable face appeared to me, worshipped even by the gods themselves. Little by little, I seemed to see the whole figure of her body rising out of the sea and standing before me. So then I set my mind to describe her divine semblance, whether the poverty of my human speech might suffer me, or whether her divine power would grant me proper eloquence in the task. First, her great abundance of hair was dispersed and scattered about her neck. On the crown of her head, she bore many garlands interlaced with flowers, and in the middle of her forehead was a glassy compass, resembling the light of the moon. In one of her hands she bore serpents, and in the other sheaves of corn. And so her heavenly form, breathing out the pleasant spice of fertile Arabia, chose with compassion to utter these words to me in her divine voice. Behold, Lucius, I am come. Your weeping and prayers have moved me to provide solace to you. I am she who is the natural mother of all things, mistress and governess of all the elements, the initial progeny of worlds, chief of powers divine, queen of heaven. I am the principal of the celestial gods, the light of the goddesses. At my will, the planets of the air, the wholesome winds of the seas, and the silences of hell are disposed. My name, my divinity, is adored throughout the world in diverse ways, through various customs and under many names. The Phrygians call me the mother of the gods, the Athenians Minerva, the Cyprians Venus, the Candians Diana, the Sicilians Prosperina, the Eleusinians Ceres, some Juno, others Bellona, others Hecate, and principally the Ethiopians in the east and the Egyptians, who are excellent in all manner of ancient doctrine and who worship me by their proper ceremonies and customs, call me Queen Isis. Lucius's prayer, an example of the personal piety that characterizes the cult of Isis, is answered. In exchange for his service to her cult, the goddess decides to restore him to human form. Healed Lucius takes part in the Isiac procession. According to accounts by witnesses to these ceremonies, the followers of Isis wore white robes, women covered their hair, and men had clean-shaven heads. The procession was led by women crowned with flowers. The initiates, without any special cult obligations, formed the center of the procession. Then Lucius moved into the temple, lived among the congregation, and during the several-day initiation ceremony explored the secrets of the cult. Here's how he describes the initiation ceremony in the temple. In fact, in the very midst of the holy temple, having indeed been commanded by the priest to stand on the summit of a platform made of wood before the image of the goddess, I was made visible by the flowers depicted on my garment, and on my shoulders hung a precious cloak behind my back down to my heels. Nevertheless, wherever you look, I was marked with animals drawn around my cloak in different colors. Here were Indian dragons, there northern griffins, which the other world had given birth to in the form of a winged great bird. On the right side I carried a torch raised with flames, and my head was surrounded by a beautiful crown of white palms with leaves spreading out like rays. So, since I was adorned in the likeness of the sun and placed in the likeness of a divine statue, after the curtains were suddenly drawn aside, people hesitated at the sight of me. Then I celebrated the most happy birth of the holy rites, and there were pleasant feasts and amusing parties. The ceremony was characterized by the asceticism typical of the Eastern cults. Roman mystery religions required fasting, refraining from food and pleasures, and even sometimes sexual abstinence. Permanent elements of the cult of Isis were pilgrimages, confessions, and donations to the temple. Like early Christians, the Isiacs accepted into their ranks those who enjoyed a good reputation. By meeting these strict criteria, they could be reborn before the congregation. As we know, the cult of Isis in Italy gradually spread from south to north. On the way of this march towards Rome was Pompeii, near today's Naples. The well-preserved ruins of the sanctuary of Isis in Pompeii were discovered in the 18th century. Built at the end of the 2nd century BC, the last reconstruction of the temple dates back to around 80 BC. The sanctuary covers around 720 square meters, took the form of an open courtyard and a covered portico, a rather traditional building with a front decorated with 4 columns. Behind the temple proper was the ecclesiasterion, a meeting place for the community. Its walls were decorated with wonderfully preserved to this day frescoes depicting the Osirian myth as it was understood by the Pompeian Isiacs. In addition to Isis, the patroness of the city, Venus Pompeiana, was also worshipped here, as well as Dionysus, who, as we know, was identified with Osiris. Such temples to the Egyptian goddess were found in cities throughout Italy, built from private funds as acts of public generosity. Sculptures, frescoes, and inscriptions were funded by members of the community, usually local nobles. The names of the founders displayed in the temple express the intimate relationship between the donor and the deity. Isis cult statues from the 1st century AD began to be created according to the canonical model propagated by the imperial authorities. Her official, unified representation is a goddess standing in contrapposto, lifting a sistrum, the most characteristic element of the cult. In her left hand she holds a situla, an ornamental ritual vessel used to draw and carry water. She wears the dress of Isis, a fringed mantle with a so-called Isis knot. Sometimes as Isis Fortuna, she holds a horn of plenty in her left hand. Unfortunately, the main Pompeian cult statue of the goddess was lost. Daily ceremonies at sunrise and sunset took place in front of it. With the first rays of the sun, apertio took place, the ceremonial opening of the temple. The magnificently dressed, jeweled statue of Isis was then greeted by kneeling worshippers dressed in a spotless white linen. The priests lit the sacred fire. According to some sources, offered the goddess water from the Holy Nile and, accompanied by the sistrums, invoked her in the Egyptian language. Luckily, there were more statues of Isis in the temple. Among them, a marble sculpture was found. Although stylized as archaic, it was dressed in the attire typical of Ptolemaic statues. Many Egyptian pharaonic sculptures have been found in Italy, often truly ancient and incomplete. There are known examples of their renovation by the Romans. For example, a pharaonic head of a man wearing a Nubian wig attached to a Hellenistic body of a woman. Artists working in Italian workshops skillfully imitated Egyptian style. However, they didn't create faithful copies, but rather played with Egyptian visual conventions. They had to meet the expectations of collectors because after the conquest of Egypt in 30 BC, the Romans were gripped by a true Egyptomania. A wealthy official named Gaius Cestius built a huge pyramid for himself in Rome, today incorporated into the Aurelian walls. And I have to admit that although today it stands at a major and busy intersection, the pyramid is truly impressive, and there were more of them in Rome. Since the time of Augustus, Egyptian granite obelisks, engineering marvels of the pharaonic New Kingdom, had been imported to Rome. Obelisks became emblems of Roman imperial enterprise. Augustus, who was competing with Alexandria, wanted to have as many of them as possible, just like his successors. As a result, although there are quite a few obelisks in Rome, I had the opportunity to see them all, there are not much left in Egypt. The Romans surrounded themselves with Egyptian art, ate bread made from Egyptian grain, and prayed more and more often in Egyptian temples. But they didn't know much about Egypt. On the one hand, scholars and philosophers who pilgrimaged to Egypt idealized the country as the cradle of civilization and the repository of the highest ancient knowledge, while on the other hand, experiencing culture shock Romans criticized the Egyptians for their laziness, promiscuity, and generally barbarism. In his 1st century AD satire, the poet Decimus Junius Juvenalis wrote, "One part adores the crocodile, another part trembles before the ibis, stuffed full with snakes. A golden effigy of a sacred long-tailed monkey shines where magic chords ring from broken-in-half Memnon and where ancient Thebes lies ruined with its 100 gates. Here, entire towns worship cats, there fish of the river, here the dog. No one worships Diana." It is a crime to break and violate the leek and the onion with a bite. O holy people, for whom these gods rise up in the gardens. Every table abstains from wool-bearing animals. It is a crime there to cut the throat of the offspring of a goat, but it is permitted to consume human flesh as food. Certainly for the Romans it was a fascinating, almost mythological place, but compared to their norms, Egypt and their culture was like night and day, a place where, according to Herodotus, women went to market and men stayed at home to weave. It's no wonder that when the cult of Isis first appeared in Rome, it encountered resistance from traditionalist patricians in the Senate, who ordered in 53 BC to destroy all of her private temples within the city walls, within the Pomerium. The location of the first temple of Isis in the city is still disputed. It may have been a private temple built on the Capitol Hill, around 100 BC. However, Roman control of the empire meant the acceptance of the deities of the conquered territories. After seizing Egypt, the cult of Isis achieved the status of Sacrum Publicum and received an officially sanctioned residence on the Campus Martius. So the first public sanctuary of Isis was established in 43 BC, the so-called Iseum Campensa. The no longer existing double sanctuary of Isis and Serapis is primarily known from the massive marble map of Rome from the 3rd century AD, the so-called Forma Urbis Roma, which indicated that the temple was about 200 meters long and 70 meters wide. The Iseum Campensa was located near the still-standing pantheon, from which it was separated by the Septa Julia, a structure that was essentially a large patio, the place where people gathered to cast votes in Republican times, and in Imperial times the Septa was a pleasant place to spend free time, a pleasure garden where works of art were exhibited. The Isiacs therefore gathered in a quiet place, away from the densely populated part of the city. The remains of the temple consist of many works with a water theme. This suggests some kind of large watery object, perhaps a fountain, on the grounds of the sanctuary itself. The fountain could have been composed of two wonderfully preserved sculptures from Iseum, personifications of two rivers, Roman and Egyptian, namely Tiberinus, now in the Louvre, and Nilus in the Vatican Museum. The temple, located in an idyllic setting, was the center of a dynamically developing cult, a cult that was peaceful in nature. It wasn't characterized by disturbing, radical behavior such as the self-mutilation of the followers of Cybele, Magna Mater, or the uncontrolled emotional outbursts of the Bacchanalia participants, suppressed by the Senate. No, the Isiacs didn't promote behavior that could be considered antisocial by Roman standards. The actions against the cult were therefore political in nature. During the reigns of the first two emperors, Augustus and Tiberius, Egyptian cults in Rome became the target. The Romans' understanding of the world in terms of simple causality encouraged the conclusion that Egyptian cults were disrupting the Pax Deorum and were therefore responsible for social unrest. But the truth is, the cult, uncontrolled by the authorities, was simply developing too fast. Emperor Tiberius, personally hostile to Egyptian cults, dealt with the Isiacs as part of his anti-Hebrew campaign. He allegedly forced 4,000 descendants of freedmen of military age to leave their homes and resettle in Sardinia because of their addiction to Egyptian superstitions. The rest, who refused to stop participating in rituals dedicated to Isis or Yahweh, also were threatened with exile from Italy. These events were remembered in the historical memory of the Romans. The reason for Tiberius' behavior, the unfair opinions about Isis as the one who attracts promiscuous girls and immoral Roman matrons can be found in the 4th century copy of Flavius Josephus' work Antiquitates Judaica. Quote, when Tiberius was emperor, the notorious licentiousness of Paulina, a woman of the highest nobility, was the subject of rumor all over Rome. Despite her outstanding reputation for chastity, she was nevertheless remarkably beautiful and exceptionally charming. Propositioned by Mundus, a cavalry commander, she resisted, but was exposed to error by the vice of excessive superstition. For corrupted priests of Isis brought orders to her as if they were from Anubis, in which he invited her to his temple and asked her, since he was delighted by her zeal and modesty, to spend the night, and said that he had something that he wanted to tell her secretly. Delighted, she received this news and brought it to her husband, telling him that the god had answered their prayers, that her presence had been requested by the god and that she could not refuse obedience, and so, in accordance with both her wishes and those of her husband, she came to the temple of Isis and spent the night. The woman appeared in the temple convinced that the god would visit her in sleep. We read further. When some of the night had passed so that in deep sleep the woman might be deceived more easily, Mundus put on a mask and dress of Anubis and entered. He lifted the bedclothes and pushed on with kissing her. When she had woken up, he told the woman that he was Anubis and showed her the mask of the god. She believed he was the god and declared that she was blessed that her lord deigned to visit her. She did not deny her embrace to him as he sought it, but asked whether a god could sleep with a human. He brought up, as examples, that Alcmena snagged Jupiter, king of the gods, and that Leda got to sleep with the same god, and there were many other women who had given birth to gods. He persuaded the woman that a god would also be born to them and had sex with her. She returned to her husband all the happier, saying that she was a woman who had slept with a god and that, according to his promise, she was pregnant with a god. The wicked Mundus met Paulina a few days later and boasted of the deception. She confessed everything to her husband, who complained to the emperor himself. With the sexual scandal as a pretext, Tiberius ordered the destruction of the Isiac Campensa in 19 AD, the execution of the priests, and even their crucifixion, according to some sources, which also mention the sinking of the temple's furnishings in the Tiber River. Interestingly, Egyptian sistrums from that time were found in the Tiber. One of them can be admired today in the British Museum. Of course, most researchers agree that this story is just propaganda attacking the institution of the Isiac, especially in its characteristic priests wearing Anubis masks during processions and ceremonies, called in Rome anubophori. But the period of persecution didn't last long. Tiberius' successor, Emperor Gaius, better known as Caligula, rebuilt the Isiac Campensa. Unexpectedly, the new ruler not only accepted Isis, but also used her doctrines to establish his new state ideology. The emperors Caligula and Nero presented a completely new style of government. In place of tradition, they presented an autocratic, centralist model of a divine emperor operating in an intermediate sphere between earth and heaven. They tried to duplicate in their style the model of rule of the Ptolemies who had once been represented by the cults of Serapis and Isis. These new ideas corresponded to the monarchical, henotheistic world of Isis, who now acquired the status of an imperial deity. From then on, images of the goddess appearing in the most remote corners of the empire symbolized the power of the emperor, and the cult itself took on great political significance. Previously closed sanctuaries were reopened, such as the Temple of Isis Capitolina, which for sure must have been operating in 69 when the supporters of Vitellius, who fought against Vespasian for the imperial throne, attacked the capital during the turbulent time of the so-called Year of the Four Emperors. According to Tacitus, during the attack, Vespasian's son, Domitian, managed to escape unnoticed thanks to an ingenious trick. He put on a white linen robe, typical of the followers of Isis, and, blending in with the crowd of worshippers, left the capital. This story suggests that the future princeps was indirectly saved by the same deities that Vespasian had chosen as his official patrons, namely Serapis and Isis. Vespasian, the founder of the new Flavian dynasty, somewhat emerged from a year-long civil war that broke out after Nero's death. Vespasian, the commander of the legions, whom the army stationed in Alexandria had proclaimed emperor, spent 1 year in the city of the Ptolemies. Alexandria welcomed him like a pharaoh, and the Egyptian oracles declared him the son of Zeus Amun, like once Alexander the Great, and the incarnation of Serapis himself, same as the Ptolemies. To strengthen his claim and to prove the divine majesty necessary to rule as emperor, Vespasian visited the Serapion in Alexandria, where he supposedly experienced an epiphany, after which the gods endowed him with healing forces. He announced that he would share his power with Serapis and Isis, and upon returning to Rome with his sons he spent the night before his triumph in the temple of Isis. Vespasian, a man of humble origins who had no connection with the ancient Julio-Claudian dynasty that ruled Rome for the last 100 years and traced its roots to Venus herself, now became the chosen of the gods, worshipped sincerely by all the Isiacs of the empire. His son, Emperor Domitian, rebuilt the Iseum after the devastating fire of 80 AD, embellishing the temples with obelisks. On one of these, now standing in Benevento in Campania, we find the following dedication. Quote, "To great Isis, mother of the god, Sothis, ruler of the gods, lord of heaven and earth and the underworld, the legate of the Augustus with the beautiful name of the immortal Domitian, Rutilius Lupus, erected for her and the gods of his city of Beneventum this obelisk, that long life in happiness may be granted him." The next emperor who spent a lot of time in Egypt was Hadrian, who went there in 130 to give vent to his intellectual needs. In Alexandria he was supposedly initiated into the mysteries. He expanded the Egyptian temples. He even went to Thebes, where he spent several nights at the foot of the Colossi of Memnon, fascinated by the mysterious sound that the statues of Amenhotep III made in the morning. Perhaps one of the graffiti carved in Greek or Latin on the legs of the Colossi belongs to the emperor himself. Despite the tragic death of his lover Antinous in the waters of the Nile, whom, by the way, he ordered the Egyptians to worship as a god, Hadrian's passion didn't diminish after his return to Italy, because he ordered another Serapeum to be built in his villa in Tibur. Another worshipper of Isis among the emperors was the eccentric Commodus, who portrayed himself in the company of Isis and Serapis and even shaved his head, and publicly wore the mask of Anubis during religious processions, which could mean that he actually performed a lower priesthood as Anubophorus. the culmination of Egyptian cults in Rome and the symbolic end of a long period of integration, is the erection of the Serapeum on the Quirinal Hill by Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, known as Caracalla, around 216 AD. Its dimensions and elevated location corresponded almost exactly to the most important Roman temple, the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitol Hill. From then on, Egyptian Serapis, the protector of the emperor, was equal to the supreme guardian of Rome. Perhaps the largest temple dedicated to Isis was the Iseum Metellinum. It owes its name to its founder, Caecilius Metellus Pius, consul, during the dictatorship of Sulla in 80 BC, so it's also one of her oldest Roman temples. It was originally a private sanctuary, arranged on 2 terraces with a very long frontage of 260 meters. The terraced sanctuary was full of balustrades, paths decorated with statues, columns, and small obelisks. In the place of the temple today stands a fragment of one of the huge fountains full of maritime symbols. The Romans celebrated the Navigium Isidis festival here. Every 5th of March, they celebrated the rule of Isis over the seas, originally a Ptolemaic festival that spread throughout the Roman Empire. One of the most important functions of the Hellenized Isis was protection over sailors, who popularized her cult on the shores of the Mediterranean Sea for a good reason. In the already cited the Ideological from the 1st century BC, we learn, "I am the queen of rivers and winds and sea. I stir up the sea and I calm it. I make the navigable unnavigable when it pleases me. I devised businesses in the sea." Isis Pelagia, Isis of the seas, or Isis Uploia, Isis of good sailing, also called Isis Pharia, associated with the symbol of Alexandria, the great lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, which took its name from the small island on which it stood, Pharos. This word became a general term for a lighthouse. Throughout the ancient Mediterranean world, in every port city one could find an image of Isis, holding a full sail and dressed in a flowing mantle, protecting ports and sailors, their savior on stormy seas. The Navigium Isidis commemorated the mythological journey of Isis on a ship from Phoenician Byblos to Egypt after collecting all the remains of Osiris. In solemn processions, the figure of Isis Pelagia was carried to the sea or a nearby river. Some see elements of this ritual in contemporary Catholic ceremonies in Italy and Spain. The Isiac mysteries, initiation rituals of purification and abstinence, all of this could pave the way for the successful integration of Christianity. Ultimately, the goddess couldn't compete with Christianity, which had developed an efficient, systematic central organization and, above all, a strong theological doctrine. The idea of Rome was permeated with Christian meaning. The empire was torn away from the pagan religious system, once an integral part of it. Pagan cults were therefore dying in the privacy of the homes. The latest Isiac inscription in Rome is dated 390, shortly after which the last emperor of the United Empire, Theodosius I, issued an edict severely prohibiting pagan practices. Although the temples were destroyed, the cult of Isis may have survived in Italy, according to some, up until the 8th century. I hope you learned something new about the beliefs of ancient Romans. Thank you for listening. I recommend you to watch and hear my other podcasts about the history and beliefs of ancient Egyptians. Please let me know in the comments what you would like to hear about next time. I'd also like to thank all my patrons. Thank you so much. Without you, it wouldn't be possible. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. If you don't support me yet but would like to, I placed my Patreon link below in the description. Don't forget to like my video and subscribe to my channel. Goodbye and see you on the next one.